All right. Glad that y'all are here. Do not forget, by the way, that Sunday is they flip time Sunday. So don't forget that, which should give you no excuse since you get an extra hour sleep. It's more of the next one that ever messes it up, but not me. I'm going to bed, but if you want to stay up, you're welcome too. We do got a few things we need to remember in our prayers. Of course, we've been praying for Freddie's sister and keep on praying for her. The little girl that I asked y'all to keep in prayers last week that had surgery in Birmingham, they did remove one of her ovaries, and she finally did get to come home. And so now they'll follow up with oncologists and everything like that, because I believe that the tumor that they pulled out was malignant. And so remember her, 'cause she's like 9 years old. Yeah, 8 or 9. And so another thing that you may have been seeing that we're praying for, that we really need to pray for, is Dawn's nephew, Ben, that just talking with Devon there for a second, has had a really, really, really rough time with the surgery that lasted. It's, as you can expect, just listening to him talk about it there for a second, and they said, hopefully this will be the worst of the days. Crossing fingers at this point. So keep him in your prayers. You said 23? 23, so definitely remember him. Recovery ahead, and long even with his parents, and of course on and else and family too. So definitely remember Ben in your prayers, especially here probably next few weeks and months coming out into all. So anything else that we need to remember in our prayers? Oh, yeah, okay. Definitely remember in Cartersville. Okay. Definitely will remember all that. Got a lot of people that we need to pray for. Anything else? All right, let's pray here together, and then we'll get started. Our Father in heaven, we are you with heavy hearts, Lord, that we have so many loved ones that we have that are going through difficulties, approaching things end of life, approaching things of just illnesses and surgeries, and Father, there are so many that we are just remember in our prayers, Lord. We know that you are the great physician and great healer, and Father, there are a few that are just on our hearts and minds, as Freddie's sister, as she is continuing to go through the things she is, Norma, as she is, and the family probably coming to a decision to make to get her off the ventilator, Chandra's uncle, and the things, and her mom, the things that they are dealing with and taking care of him. And Father, of course, with Ben and the surgery, and for Carla and Bill and Dawn and Devon and that whole family, Father, we just pray that you will be with the doctors and the nurses and the recovery from surgery. Lord, that you will heal him and remove the healing and the different struggles, put him back on path of healing and back to life. Father, of in your hands, and Father, we pray that you will be with all of these that we have mentioned tonight and be with the families that are going through this right alongside them. We thank you for Jesus, and it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, we are in John 21, the last chapter of John. We will start something else. You just have to wait to find out. I mean, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I've probably told you. We're probably looking at Genesis coming up, since that's kind of what I know our kids are going to be studying with Bible Bowl. It will not be this word verse by verse because it's too big. It'll take us a year and a half to get to do that. So we're a little bit different. But let's get through here in chapter 2. If chapter the prologue to the book, chapter 21 is your epilogue. Basically, the big ended. The last chapter we're at, that's the resurrection, and that takes place in Judea. And now everything has moved from Judea, and it's moving up to Galilee. So I want you to get this, because if we are, say, a few days removed from the resurrection, and chapter 20 with some of that, a couple of days in there with the resurrection and following that, Galilee, we're only going to be up in Galilee a few days to a week or two because it's a shorter period of time. They've got to come back to Jerusalem. It's a short amount of time before Jesus goes back up. So Acts chapter 1, let me kind of put this into kind of perspective of what we're talking about here. Acts chapter 1 is a 10-ish days or so before, 7 to 10 days before Pentecost. And we know they're in Jerusalem by then, chapter 1, because of what Jesus told them of saying, we want you to stay here in Jerusalem until you come with power, and then you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, parts of the world. So there between these first couple of days after John chapter 20, John chapter 21 takes place, and they've made a journey back to Galilee. That's where we are at in John 21. So you kind of see taking place here. We'll start in verse 1, and we'll go from there. We'll keep a lot of this together in packs. This probably shouldn't be too long to get through chapter 21 tonight. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples of Tiberias, and he revealed this way: Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Galilee, of Cana, which is interesting. Just a pause. A lot about Nathanael at all in any of the Gospels, really. In fact, didn't even know he was necessarily from Galilee. And in particular, he's in Cana of Galilee. In Cana of Galilee. Wedding. Yes, the wedding feast. So that's where Jesus' first place. So that's probably his home. The sons of Zebedee, the two other disciples were together. So these people here, Simon Peter, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got in the boat. That night, they caught nothing. So just fishermen, they're going out, and I'm not sure why Peter did this. You know, if you contemplate everything that has taken place from chapter 20 with the resurrection and those big scenes, we know that Jesus had at least 2 appearances from, right? That he had them on that night after he's resurrected, and then later when Thomas is finally there. And so we know that there's 2 appearances, and so apparently this is going to be the third he's going to have with these disciples. I don't know why they went back to Galilee. That's a very interesting concept. Maybe they went because this was kind of normal to them, his home. Jesus probably in somewhere in this disappeared again. Remember, basically for the last 3 years, Jesus has been with them. They have been with Jesus in and out every day of their lives. Jesus is crucified, and now their whole life has been turned upside down. Even though it's turned upside down, the resurrection has happened. It's still not normal. It's still not what it was. And so some knows, and I think that's probably, and they're going back to doing what they know to do. They're going back and fishing. And so they're out here at night doing all of this. So, verse 4, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know it was Jesus. We'll try to read into this. There's two ways to look at this. And I know I should overly try to miracleize this in any way. There's one way to look at it as, well, something Jesus did, them praising him. Because remember, you kind of get this picture a little bit. We talked a little bit about it last week with Mary. She didn't recognize it was Jesus. She thought it was the gardener. But there's a human aspect she couldn't. I'm not sure I do read a lot into this one either, because it is dark outside. So it's just coming. They're out in the water. It's not like they're close to land. And, I don't know if their eyesight, like if their eyesight is like mine right now without my glasses on, I look like a bunch of blurs to me. I can't imagine being in the ocean or in the sea fishing and somebody's talking from the shore because they couldn't recognize them. But Jesus says to them in verse 5, children, do you have fish? That's interesting that he uses the word children there. It's also going to be a word that John will use in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 1 when he says, my little children, I write to you that you may not sin, but if it do sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. Very interesting that he uses the word here. Now, and I didn't do a deep dive into this, but there are two words in Greek for children. And one word is an immature, it's an immature meaning. They don't know what they're doing. They're not, not talking about. And if I'm remembering right, this is the word, which means it's the same word that John uses in 1 John chapter 2 when he is talking about like a mature aspect in all of this. So this is not just, he's not calling them little kids in a sense of, hey, people, do you have any fish? They said to him, no. He said, have the boat. And now there was superstition within fishermen that it's always better on the right side of the boat. I mean, we still kind of have that today. How many of you wake up and you roll out on the right side of the bed? And right? You ever, I guess, someone looking at me like what? You've never heard that before, right? So literally, they talk about if you wake up grumpy, oh, you didn't roll out on the right side of the bed this morning. So there you go. So literally, I will as I am on the right side of the bed, so I will roll out on the right side. So there you go. And so there was the superstition that the right always the best side. That's where you can get everything that was there. And so he says, cast the side of the boat. So they cast it. Now they were not able to hold in because of the quantity of the fish. Then who recognizes this? Verse 7, that disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore said to Peter, it is the Lord. It's funny that Peter and John kind of have these things back and forth, because remember, go back to John chapter 20. John's the first one to get to He's looking in, trying to figure out what he's seeing. Peter comes in there and just like whatever's going on. But John's really the first one like, I get this. I see what's taking place. He's resurrected. It's interesting here. Who's the first one to mention? It's John. I don't know if it is because of the miracle of the fish grabbing all of it, if it's something in the voice that he recognizes that it's him. He says, this is Jesus. And notice what Peter does. Peter, in his day, it should not surprise anybody how he did it. Simon Peter, he put his outer garments, for he was stripped for work. So, basically they're saying garments fishing. Get everything. So he get everything back on, and he threw himself into the sea. There's people There's your reminiscence of Matthew 14, right? Where you got the Jesus walking there, and Peter's like, oh, that's really you. Let me come out there. Oh, come on. And here's Peter stepping out on the boat. All would sit back and say, hey, guys, I'm just going to jump in and just go. But what is that says about? What? Okay, because that's going to be a discussion he's about to have with them about this relationship with him. What else does it say, do you think? Or is it just maybe he's Peter being Peter? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is going to be interesting to come up because what Freddie mentioned here, the conversation that Peter and Jesus are going to have, because what was Peter's response to Jesus' warning that, hey, this is what's about to happen to me? Nope, we're going to stand up. We're going to fight for you. We're going to do all of this. And then when push came to shove, he sort of did. Then he took off and disappeared again. And so here's Peter jumping in the boat. And I love how John writes this next little section here. The other in the boat dragging the fish, for they were not far from land, but about 100 yards off. So their football field's off going in. The rest of them are just like, we'll get there. Yes. Oh, we'll get to it in a second. There are some people that try to figure it out. I'll be flat honest with you before we get to it, but I don't know. Some people have tried to read into it that the 1 and the 5 means something different. I mean, even to the point that Jesus is about to serve them fish and everything. So we'll get to that, but I don't know. I'll just tell you that straight up. I don't know. Verse 9. Land they saw a place with fish laid out on it and bread. So here is Jesus cooking them breakfast for them. They've been out all night and they've been working, they're fishing, they're probably definitely tired, and here they are at bringing, Jesus is the one cooking the breakfast, guys. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have caught. So maybe, I guess, Jesus had enough fish there, and it's like, hey, we're going to do some of this that's here. So whether or not he's grilling it or he is boiling water and the fish are cooking in it, situation. Simon, and so here's what's interesting. Who brought the fish to sea in the net originally? Verse 8. Who brings it? People that are drawing this net in, full of fish. This says a little bit about Peter. Okay? Now, true, they were in deeper water and they're bringing the net. So that's automatically going to mean that it's heavy. It's interesting because here's Peter. Peter goes out, verse 11, went abroad and the net ashore full of large, 153 of them. And although there were so many, their net was not torn. So basically they're saying this net is full, and it shows a little bit about how strong Peter is. Peter's not a weakling. So I would imagine he is not only does he have a personality that's pretty big, but he's also probably a guy that is very, at least, strong in stature, which may say a little bit also about Peter and leadership. On a leadership. And so there was there's theory in leadership that lead certain ways. Remember when Saul was king? What was and the reason why he was chosen to be king? He was bigger than everybody else. So he had this presence about him, about other people. Peter definitely had the charisma, and he probably had the size that maybe he towered over some of the others. Apparently he is a strong man being able to pull this out. Interesting here that the net's Maybe there's a miracle taking place in that picture there, but it is basically to say, hey, this net was completely full, and it's, on any other time. Probably. Mm-hmm. So Rachel was saying, for those who couldn't hear back there, is that could this be part of Peter's guilt? And we eager to want to jump on board after denying Jesus, and I think there's probably definitely some of that there, which is going to lead what Jesus is about to have, makes it even bigger in all of this. Because Jesus did what he was going to do. Now, how did Peter's denial get in these other books? Well, somebody had to know, somebody had to tell. I don't know if it's Peter told. It could have been somebody else who was there witnessing all of this. Could be John that was there and witnessed some of these things. And apparently John had a little rivalry here. Would probably be quick to throw that up. And so maybe there's definitely a lot of guilt within Peter. I've always thought there's a lot of guilt within Peter after that took place. And you know how we are. For those of you who are married in here, I'll talk to the husband for a second. If you mess up, your wife asks you to do something and you didn't do it, or y'all got into an argument or whatever else, and you feel bad afterwards, usually you're pretty quick to be like, oh, let me try to make this up to her. Where that's kind of human nature, right? Okay. Meaning the rock? Mm-hmm. You definitely see that he is going to use Peter. I mean, if you go back and you look at when he makes the confession, and Jesus says, upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom. Who do we recorded opening the doors to the keys to the kingdom? Well, Acts. Who unlocks the door? Peter. Okay, we get to Acts chapter 10. Who's opening the doors to the Gentiles? Peter and Cornelius. So, in a sense, he is going to use. Leads to the conversation that Jesus is going to have with him in just a second, and it does a little bit of Peter and Peter's personality and his presence that he had. And there's a lot of symbolism in all of this. One of the commentaries I was reading about this, the symbol for Christians, I don't know really when you want to happens. Somewhere in probably 2nd century on, the ichthus. It's an acrostic from Greek, meaning Jesus, the Son, Savior, and it's in the symbol of a fish. You see it on the back of cars and stuff like that. People say there's a symbolism here because that's what Jesus is using right here and feeding these guys, something about the fish and like that. Maybe. And the challenge that we have with numbers, like you asked a second ago about 153, is there a meaning by it? The challenge that we have with numerology or symbolism is sometimes it's left up to our own interpretation. And there's where danger can come involved with it, is when we are trying to say, oh, it's got to be this. For instance, not to get into this discussion, 666 from is Antichrist? Is it Nero? Is it one of the kings or something like this? So a challenge that we have. I would love to and say, ooh, is there a meaning behind this or a symbolism? I think we just got to be cautious with it because we really have nothing to direct us that way. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mhm. The other person. Yep. A fish. Right. Right. And that's some of the things that have come down. Um, I like Ken's face right. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He didn't think it was flat. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's why we have to, and that's why I think we have to be careful with what we say with that. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm meaning. Yeah. With his disciples. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, the fullness, and I do think that it has a connection with the net of being just showing how full it is, yet didn't break. I definitely think there's something in there to say this was something that happened after all. They were out all night, didn't catch anything. Jesus shows up. Hey, throw it on the other side. Voila, we got a full net. Hmm. It is a big giant lake. Yeah. Hmm. Yep. Lake that's sitting out there, basically. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And what it was. It was just a giant. I do think, if he put it in there, I don't know. Nothing that I can find. If anything left, the fishing industry in Galilee was gone after that. So I don't know. Well, let's get back here again here to this. So Jesus said to them, verse 12, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask them who you are. They knew it was the Lord. So that's interesting. I think that's an interesting piece, the way John writes it. None of them dared ask who you are. May go to, again a little bit describing that there is a resurrected body than a physical body. Um, Not quite sure. As Ken said, to be careful not to read too much. But I do think it's interesting that they didn't dare ask him, "Who are you?" Number one, they've twice before. Now this is the third time that they're propping up it to him. But it is interesting that John is in there. Mm-hmm. In one of the other gospel accounts, when some disciples are on the road to the Emmaus, that it stopped them from seeing who it was at that point. There's definitely a miracle thing. Like, I'm not sure, probably. I read into that. I read into that similar to what we've read here in chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, where it was saying these guys were ready to kill him, but it was not yet his time, and so somehow out of the situation as a specific way that the announcing of Jesus' resurrection was taking place. And so I I don't know. We've got to be careful with it, but yes, there is an incident when their eyes did not recognize who it was that was talking to them. So, and some of that could be happening in some of this here. Verse 13. Let's go on further here. So Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, and so with the fish, this was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So this is probably a few days, maybe a week. So don't forget, Pentecost is 50 days after Passover, after the Sabbath. There's a different way of adding it. So basically it's 50 days. So we are probably, who knows, 42, 43, 40, heading to Pentecost. And like I said, Jesus is on earth here for about 20-ish to 25 days-ish before he's taken back up. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, what seems to be happening is, in this, and there's some textual variance in this too, is that Jesus takes Peter on a private talk, not to sit here and hear everybody. That this, we're going to walk on the beach conversation and have this. So, now, here's some other things we need to be careful that we don't read much, but I'll mention it here. So when he says, "Simon, son of John, do you agape me?" is the word in Greek. He says, "Do you agape me?" Which is, very, very, you willing to give up yourself. But notice what he says this, though. And if he is in private, look at what he's specifically asking. Do you love me more than who? Who are these? The other disciples. I think it's the other disciples. Do you love me more than these guys do? Remember where we were just at a week ago. He's denying him after he just stood up and said, "I will stand up for you." Now, in fairness to Peter, where were the rest of these disciples? Split, still there around, which is going to be interesting. It's going to be a little sneaky in this story here too. Disappear. So in fairness to Peter, they all disappeared, but they didn't deny him like he did in front of everybody. So he says, "Do you agape me? Do you love me in this way more than the rest of these disciples?" And he says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you." That's brotherly love. That's usually where we talk about the brotherly love, this affectionate thing. And in Peter's human mind, I think he is saying, "I love you with this family member," as something that's deeper than just whatever in this. So he says, if you do, point. He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you agape me?" Agape. Do you really love me here? And he said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you." Again, that brotherly love. This deep connection in here. He says, "Here's what I want you to do then. I want you to tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you phileo me?" Agape here. Now he's using the same term that Jesus is using. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. Peter was grieved when he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" "Lord, you know everything. You know that I phileo you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." In century Greek, preachers like to use this, and we talk about there's 5 different words for love and this and this and this. Don't overread into that. You were getting ready to say that? Don't overread into that. They would use these interchangeably. But Jesus I think there is something there, since he is saying, "Do you agape me more? Are you willing to give up everything for?" And he's you with all the love that I have as a human possibly can. And maybe he didn't understand agape love even at that point. He says something a little bit later with some of these statements like feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my lambs, all that stuff. Because later in 1 Peter chapter 2, he talks about elders being the shepherd and how they're supposed to shepherd these things and take care of the same manner. So maybe he learns it along the way. So I guess what I'm saying is don't necessarily read into the two different loves, because I think Peter is trying to say, I do love everything I have in me. Yes. Yep. Right. Right. Sure. I definitely think it is. I definitely think you want to, you were talking, Freddie, about symbolism here. I definitely think there's denials having three questions here. Now, what's interesting, look at the statement. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. Who are the lambs? I think it's church. And lamb, is it a sheep? It's a baby sheep. To begin and baby. And it's going to grow. And the second point in there, and he's not just that I want you to feed these, you're going to take care of this church. Well, I think what he is talking about here, I agree 100% with Ken, is this is the church. And that he is saying, you're going to, Acts chapter 2, part of the church, and you got these 3,000 baby sheep that have just started. And then what church continuing steadfastly in the apostles' teaching and doctrine, prayer, and all from day to day. And then ultimately he says, feed my sheep. Well, now you got an adult church. And I think that's what you can see. You see that in his writings in 1st and 2nd Peter, especially 1st Peter in there. You see that he is feeding them as adult sheep. They're dealing with stuff and later with what's going to happen to him. So let's go back to this. It says, so he said all of these things, verse 18. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you dressed yourself and you walked wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Now, let's take that as face value. Okay, he's basically saying, hey, that happens to us. That's life. When you get older, when you're young, people else dress you to do what you want to do. When you're older, other people got to dress you too, right? And go do whatever. However, John throws a parenthetical statement in verse 19. This he said to show by what kind of death he was going to glorify God. Now, in 96 AD, 95 AD, Clement of Rome, who is a kind of a contemporary of Peter, he would write about Peter's death, that Peter is crucified. Later on, you have Eusebius and you have some people that take the legend that he was crucified upside down. We don't know. I'm just going to tell you, we just don't know that. We got pretty good, especially from Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome, as a sidebar, he actually writes 2 books that, if you ever get a chance to read them, are really, really good 2 letters. In fact, these were 2 letters that were used in the early church, were considered to be put in the New Testament when it was being compiled. But when they had to try to with some of these, that's when they had to decide, well, if it's not written by an apostle or a commission, we're not going to Testament and 1st and 2nd Clement were taken out. But if you see what the early church was doing in worship and things like that, read 1st or 2nd Clement. Very interesting, some very good stuff. So I guess because what I'm saying is he's pretty close to this, and he was a contemporary of of Peter, probably worked with Peter in there, hand in hand with some things, especially if Peter did get to Rome. And he says he was crucified. And so what the illustration is, you have somebody carry you, and your arms are going to be outstretched, right? So carrying the cross beam of the crucifix, and then ultimately when he's crucified, your hand is. And it's interesting that he says this was what kind of death that he was going to glory. What was talking about Jesus' crucifixion, his death would bring? Glory to God in there. And so I think it's interesting that he throws that both in there. And then Jesus said after this, he said to him, follow me. So he tells him, you're going to die like I did. Imagine if you're Peter thinking that for the next, if he died mid-60s, next 35 years going on. Oh, well, one of these days I'm going to be crucified, and that's just going to be great. So now here's the sneak part that happens. Verse 20. Turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. Oh, you got a little sneaker here. Here's John. Peter and John walking along the beach, and John is sneaking in behind them. Watching all this stuff take place. I don't know why John is doing that. I don't know. Maybe he wants to listen to exactly what's being said. Ever, because Peter's not going to tell everybody. But he sees John following them. The one had been at the table close to the Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? So here's a little picture that it's a flashback back to the Last Supper. So how many of you have seen the picture of the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci? You've seen it. The person that is laying on the, if you're looking at it, it's on this side, so it'll be on this side of Jesus. That is who they picture to be John. I'm not getting into the Da Vinci Code thing, but more feminine because he's younger. John is the youngest of all of these. But you see him laying on Jesus in Da Vinci's painting. Yeah, I mean that's apparently where Da Vinci gets it from, is this section here. And so you get this little picture that, and because remember, this is called the disciple whom Jesus loved. So apparently there's a special relationship also between John and Jesus. And maybe Peter's a little jealous in here because he's throwing that out. And John's little thing is, well, I was close to him and I was laying on him. And so verse 21, look at, when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? He is asking, how's this man going to die? Is he going to die like I am? Is he going to, he's one of your favorites. Is he going to be this way? Look at Jesus' response. It is that he should remain until I come. What is that to you? You follow me. Oh, now that's kind of interesting. Go ahead, kid. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes. That's what I was about to go. Oh, absolutely. And because remember, it's James and John's mom that talks to Jesus and is like, hey, which one of my sons? I want one on the right hand and one on the left hand when you come. And then he's going to be last in all of this. So yes, I do think there's some one up. And you see that in chapter 20. You see that here in chapter 1. John's giving that little thing. Well, I outran Peter, and all that stuff. But he is saying, but notice what Jesus is saying. It doesn't matter how he's going to die. If I want him to live until I return, there's a clue that Jesus is talking about a future event. So he's giving a little clue that probably of saying there's going to be a return. Now remember, if you read the disciples, and especially Paul, I think Paul, in his early writings, is expecting Jesus to return in his lifetime. He is not expecting. When you see, is it Philippians? can't remember what verse, I want to say verse 20, but I don't think that's right, where he is sitting here saying that we should be eagerly waiting. I think you see it. He's ready to come. He's like, I'm ready for you to do it. I'm going to stay here or whatever. That's fine to come. And then finally you get to 2 Timothy 4, and he's like, okay, Jesus isn't coming back, but he will one day type of thing. So you kind of, and so Jesus is talking about a future event. Now, there's things that have happened here. If this is being written in the late 80s, early 90s, somewhere in there, either John is dead, and so they're having to fix this situation because some people probably took this as this disciple's never going to die. Well, if that's the case, we should have a 2,000-year-old disciple. Has died and they need to fix the situation, or John is saying that's not what Jesus is talking about. It's just saying if I wanted to stay, he wanted me to stay until I came back, that's up to him. And we all know John's going to die a natural death. He's going to die early 100s in there. Yes, and that's what he's basically to all of us. Because I think there is a principle here for all of us. Say that the Lord blesses Rachel with everything through and through and through. And then Freddie, he doesn't give you anything. Heartache and you get heartache and stuff that you go through. Well, why does she and I don't? It doesn't matter. He says, you follow me. And that's the right. It's not, and the point is, it doesn't matter if your life is blessed above all abundance, or you have nothing. Except said, don't worry, if you seek me, I will give you the things you need. You'll have a place to live. You will eat. You follow me. And I think, especially in Western gospel preaching, or gospel preaching, you have this thing, well, the more stuff I have, that means I'm more blessed by God, I'm more loved by God. Living members of the church in Ukraine or China aren't as blessed by God as we are. Ultimately, it's salvation, right? It's heaven. And so, sure. And that's where, and that's what I think he's Peter. Regardless of what happens on, you have a job, you follow me. So look at verse 23. So saying spread, this is what we were just talking about, abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die, yet Jesus did not say to him that it was not to die. He says, but if it is my will that he should remain until I come, what is that to you? So he's repeating this because when he's writing this, people are apparently, well, John's going to live forever. And John's saying, no, I'm not saying I'm going to live forever. He just said it's none of your business. And what God does for over somebody else is none of our business. You follow him. Regardless. Now, you got two little close sentences in here, and they're kind of each little thing in here. One is giving two different aspects. Now, we have this. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have these four gospels that are here. Right? Matthew is an eyewitness. John is an eyewitness. Mark is not an eyewitness. Mark is Peter's memoir. Luke is a Gentile, and he's basically making a biography of the situation. John is an eyewitness that's still alive. So what you have happening here at the first century is all the disciples, all the other eyewitnesses are gone. He's the only one that is left. And you would automatically think that the early church would look at John and be like, I want to grasp everything I get to him. Walk with him. You got to talk with him. You got to eat with him. You got to sleep where he was. You got to pray with him. You got to do all these things. Verse a testimony thing of saying, look, I witnessed all this. This is a disciple who is about these things and who has written these things and know that his testimony is true. So he's trying to encourage them, especially if we go back and we're saying that part of the reason he's writing this gospel is against early Gnosticism. And this whole thing and the whole principle was that very last of chapter 20, these things are written so that you could believe, and that believing you could have salvation. And so he's saying, I witnessed this, trust what I'm saying. 5. Now, this is the second kind of prologue in here. Now, there were also many other things Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could contain the books that would be written. So, if you will look back at what John said, we've studied all of it. We have said that certain things that John put in his gospel that Matthew, Mark, and Luke put in his gospel. John seems to focus writing on the last year and a half of Jesus' life. And then when you get about the last half of the book, it's about 6 months of Jesus' life. So he says there were many other things that he did. There are and stuff that you don't have in John, or you have in Mark that you don't have in John. And he says, this is what is here, but these things are written. And this is what I am writing to you, going back to chapter 20, so that you and I could have a belief that what he was saying was right. And so it's got to the early church coming from a legitimate eyewitness. At this point, 15 years on his life to go. So, very interesting. So we are at the end of John. Anybody got any questions or comments about the whole gospel and all of this that we've been talking about? You know, John is such an interesting book. That's why I wanted to look at John versus Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have their own great studies. Because if there's a book that's written for us, it's John. Because he's writing to a world that is far removed from the early church, is writing to a world that's removed from Jerusalem, because the temple to the group of people that did not witness any of these things, like us. And he ties it. I mean, he goes back to creation, doesn't he, there in John chapter 1, and ties it all together that says this is what it's all about. That is why we date the way we date. Change it a little bit, but that's the reason why we date. You know, we date life because there has been no other figure in human history that has affected man as Jesus. Death. And that is what has changed in who we are and what we do and everything else. Muhammad sure never did. Abraham didn't. Moses did to a point, but he didn't affect the whole world like what Jesus did. And so, anything else anybody got to throw in here? Don't study Genesis. Okay. Well, that can answer all the questions that we're going to dive into and ask. We will have some interesting things. I'm going to try to keep them more thematic in there. We'll spend some time chapters 1, 2, and 3. You got to spend some time 1, 2, and 3. But then we'll spend some time when we get to chapter 6, especially with the flood and some other things in there. Yeah, I am. We're going to the beginning. Well, here's the deal. Some of these things we have learned all of our lives. And sometimes we take them for granted a little bit because we have learned most of them. Because most of us in here have gone to church all of our lives at some point or the other. But there's some people that haven't. And so, you know, there's sometimes some of these stories that we kind of need to wrap up and grab a hold of. And we take for granted. I know I take for granted a lot of just like if I throw out, Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, probably 90% of you know exactly where I'm going to talk about and the promise and everything else. But then if I start going a little bit deeper and I talk about the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, do you know what I'm talking about in there? Some of you will, because I know Marisha will, because we've already had that conversation before on that one in my view of what the sons of God are. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this will be good because this is what our kids, like I said, if our kids who are in lads are participating in Bible Bowl, this is what they're studying this year for Bible Bowl, is this. And so there's a lot of good stuff. Now, there's some boring stuff. I won't lie. We'll skip over that. I'm not going to dive into the genealogy. Just not going to. Except I will use it to point out a couple of things. I will say that. All right. We'll see y'all Sunday. Don't forget, time change. Woohoo!